Behind the bolted doors and flickering fluorescence lies a labyrinth where minds unravel and reality twists. The mental health hospital. Here, silence isn't quiet, it's a cacophony of unspoken screams. Walls absorb confessions, medication cups rattle like fate's dice, and shadows stretch into shapes only the broken-eyed see. For the staff, this is a world of paradoxes, a sanctuary and a prison where healing hands battle invisible demons as potent as any disease. They're the guardians of fractured psyches, stitching sanity with therapy, empathy, and pills. But what happens when the darkness pushes back? What if the mind isn't the only thing haunting these halls? Forget urban legends. These are bone-deep truths from nurses and orderlies who've walked corridors thick with dread, where phantom voices hiss from empty rooms, patients predict tragedies before they strike, and the delusions start to sound alarmingly real. Stories of clocks stopping at the same cursed hour, of shadow figures trailing the newly discharged, and of one chilling question: are the patients unstable or tuned into something we can't see? This isn't about diagnoses. It's about the unholy overlap of mental agony and the supernatural. The moments when a schizophrenic's ravings map to a stranger's unsolved death. When a manic episode peaks as cold spots grip the ward. When the line between psychosis and possession blurs, and nobody wants to say it aloud. Lock in. These accounts will stalk your thoughts. You'll never hear a midnight scream the same way again. It was my third year at St. Agnes Psychiatric Hospital when I encountered something I still can't fully explain. I'd been a nurse long enough to handle the chaos of the job. Patients screaming through delusions, sudden violent outbursts, even the rare escape attempt. But the locked ward tested me in ways I never imagined. The locked ward was reserved for our most dangerous patients, those deemed a risk to themselves or others. It was a fortress of heavy steel doors, constant monitoring, and rigid schedules. I worked the night shift, clipboard in hand, moving from room to room under the hum of fluorescent lights. That night, a storm raged outside, rattling the windows and making the air feel thick with tension. His name was Michael Greer, a 32-year-old with paranoid schizophrenia. He'd been admitted after attacking his neighbor, convinced the man was a government agent sent to poison him. Michael was a big guy, over 6 feet, with wild eyes that never seemed to settle. We kept him medicated, but his mind always clung to fragments of his delusions. Around midnight during my rounds, I heard a faint tapping coming from his room. I approached the door and looked through the small, reinforced window. Michael sat on his bed, staring at the wall, his fingers drumming against the mattress in a steady rhythm. I was about to move on when he snapped his head toward me, locking eyes with mine. His pupils were dilated, his lips twisting into a smile that made my stomach drop. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice muffled through the glass. "Who's coming, Michael?" I asked, keeping my tone calm despite the unease creeping up my spine. He didn't reply. He just resumed his tapping, faster now, like he was counting down to something. I scribbled a note to check his meds in the morning and continued my rounds, brushing it off as another symptom of his illness. But at 3 a.m., everything changed. The storm had worsened, and the hospital's power flickered, lights dimming, then surging back with a harsh buzz. I was at the nurse's station, sipping lukewarm coffee, when a scream tore through the silence. It was Michael, his voice raw and primal, echoing down the hall. I grabbed my radio and ran, calling for backup as my sneakers squeaked against the linoleum. When I reached his room, I stopped dead. Through the window, I saw Michael standing in the center, arms outstretched, head tilted back like he was in some kind of trance. But what froze me wasn't him. It was the thing behind him. It was tall, impossibly so, with limbs that stretched too long for any human frame. Its skin was a sickly gray, and its face was shrouded in shadow, except for 2 glowing eyes that burned like embers. It stood behind Michael, its bony fingers resting on his shoulders, possessive and still. I blinked, and it vanished. Michael crumpled to the floor, his body seizing. I fumbled with my keys, burst inside, and dropped to my knees beside him. "Michael, stay with me," I shouted, checking his pulse as his convulsions slowed. By the time the other nurses arrived, he was gone, eyes open, staring at nothing. The autopsy later said cardiac arrest, cause unknown. But I knew better. After that night, the locked ward changed. Patients started whispering about a tall man who visited them in the dark, hissing promises of freedom or threats of pain. We upped security, added staff, but it didn't stop. One patient clawed his arms raw, saying the man told him to let the blood out. Another swore she saw it in her room, pointing at her from the shadows. Then, weeks later, I saw it again. I was passing Michael's old room, empty now, when a coldness gripped me. I turned, and there it was at the end of the hallway, those glowing eyes, that skeletal frame. It raised a finger and pointed at me. My vision blurred, my legs locked, and the next thing I knew, I was in the break room, colleagues shaking me awake, saying I'd been screaming. I never told them what I saw. I requested a transfer the next day and left the locked ward behind. But sometimes, in the quiet of my new ward, I hear that tapping, like fingers on a mattress, and I wonder if it followed me. I've been at Greenbrier Mental Health Facility for 8 years, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that silence can be louder than any scream. Patient 47 proved that to me in ways I'll never forget. She came to us as a mystery. The police found her wandering the streets, barefoot and mute, with no ID or history. Late 20s, thin as a rail, with dark hair that hung over her face like a curtain. She wouldn't speak, not to cops, not to doctors, so they sent her to our long-term care ward. We called her Patient 47, a placeholder until we could figure out who she was. Months passed, and she just sat there, staring out her window, a statue in a hospital gown. We tried everything to reach her, therapy sessions, meds, even music. Nothing worked. She became part of the ward's rhythm, a quiet fixture we stopped expecting to change. Until one night she did. I was on the graveyard shift, walking the halls with my flashlight, when I heard it, a soft humming, low and eerie, drifting from her room. I crept closer, peering through the door's window. Patient 47 stood by hers, back to me, head cocked like she was listening to something beyond the glass. The sound wasn't loud, but it raised the hairs on my neck. I stepped inside, cautious. "You okay?" I asked, not expecting an answer. She turned slow, deliberate, and her eyes met mine, clear, intense, like she'd just woken up. Then she spoke, her voice a raspy whisper, "They're here." I froze. "Who's here?" She pointed at the window, her hand trembling. I looked, but the courtyard outside was empty, just shadows swaying in the wind. "There's nothing there," I said, more to calm myself than her. "They're coming for me," she hissed, stepping closer. "They're coming for all of us." Before I could react, the lights flickered, and the room turned ice cold. I felt something behind me, a heavy, suffocating presence that pressed against my ribs. I spun around, but there was nothing, just the bare walls and the hum of the heater. When I turned back, Patient 47 was gone. I searched everywhere, her room, the halls, the bathrooms. Nothing. The cameras showed her standing there 1 second, then vanishing the next, like she'd dissolved into thin air. We locked down the ward, called the police, but she was gone without a trace. After that, things got strange. Patients started hearing whispers at night, garbled voices in no language we knew. Nurses reported shadows darting across empty rooms, and I kept finding cold spots where no draft could explain them. I told myself it was stress, or maybe the ward feeding off its own fear. But a week later, I found a note under my locker door, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "They took me. They'll take you too." Below it was a rough sketch, a door with 3 lines scratched down the middle. I showed it to my supervisor, but he brushed it off as a prank. The hospital hushed it up, and Patient 47 became a ghost story we didn't tell. I still hear that humming sometimes, faint and far off, like she's trying to warn me. I don't know what took her, or what they are, but I lock my doors tight at night just in case. I've worked at Oakwood Asylum for 15 years, and I've seen the mind twist itself into knots no one can untie. But Room 13 taught me that some horrors aren't born in the head, they slip in from somewhere else. Room 13 was our isolation unit, a bare cell with a bed, a chair, and an old mirror bolted to the wall. The mirror was ancient, its edges chipped and its surface foggy, but it stayed because regulations allowed one reflective surface per room. Most patients ignored it. David Lawson didn't. David was new, admitted after a psychotic break left him raving about something chasing him, something he could only see in reflections. He was in his 30s, wiry, with a nervous tic that made his hands twitch. We chalked his ramblings up to paranoia, but his fear was so real it clung to the air around him. One evening I went to give him his meds. He was sitting on the bed, staring at the mirror like it might swallow him whole. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead, hands gripping the sheets. "David, time for your pills," I said gently. He didn't move, didn't blink, just kept staring. I stepped closer, glancing at the mirror to see what held him. It was just us, his hunched figure, my reflection behind him in my scrubs. "David, look at me," I pressed. He turned his head, but his eyes stayed glued to the glass. "It's there," he whispered. "It's always there." I checked the mirror again. Nothing but us. "There's no one else here," I said, though a flicker of doubt crept in. "Look closer," he begged, voice breaking. I humored him, leaning toward the mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw something. A shadow behind my reflection, too tall, too still. I blinked and it was gone. "It's just the light," I said, but my mouth felt dry. David shook his head, tears spilling. "It's waiting. For me. For all of us." I gave him his meds and left, but his words stuck with me. Later, as I passed Room 13 on my way out, I heard a faint scratching, nails on glass, steady and deliberate. I opened the door. David was asleep, the room quiet. I turned to go, but my reflection caught my eye, and there it was. A figure behind me, tall and dark, with eyes like smoldering coals. I gasped, spun around, nothing. The mirror was empty again. Over the next few weeks, others noticed it too. Nurses heard whispers from the mirror. Patients refused to enter Room 13, saying they felt watched. Then David vanished. One morning his room was empty, bed made, mirror cracked corner to corner, no sign of him. We searched for days, but he was gone, like he'd never been there. We shut down Room 13 after that. The mirror was smashed and hauled away, but the stories lingered. Some say if you whisper David's name into a mirror at night, 3 times, you'll see it, the thing that took him, waiting for its next chance. I tell myself it's nonsense. But I avoid mirrors now, especially in the dark. Some things, once seen, don't let you go. I've worked at St. Agnes Psychiatric Hospital long enough to know that the patients' minds can twist reality into something unrecognizable. But after 12 years, I thought I could tell the difference between their delusions and the truth. That was before I met Emily Price, and before the walls started talking. Emily was admitted in the fall, a 28-year-old with acute schizophrenia. She was fragile, all sharp angles and hollow eyes, her blonde hair tangled like she'd been clawing at it. Her intake notes said she heard voices, not unusual in her diagnosis, but she insisted they weren't in her head. "They're in the walls," she told me on her first day, her voice trembling. "They know my name." I chalked it up to her illness. St. Agnes is old, built in the 1920s, and its pipes groan and creak all the time. I figured she was amplifying the sounds into something sinister. I reassured her, adjusted her meds, and moved on. But that night, as I walked the dim corridors during my shift, I heard it, a faint murmur, like a crowd whispering just out of earshot. I stopped, my sneakers squeaking on the linoleum. The sound was coming from the wall beside Emily's room, a low hum that rose and fell like breathing. I pressed my ear against the cold plaster, and the whispers sharpened into words. Sarah, Sarah, my name, unmistakable, hissed from nowhere. I yanked back, heart hammering. The corridor was empty, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I told myself it was exhaustion. 12-hour shifts will play tricks on you, but the air felt heavier, thick with the scent of mildew and something sour. The next day, Emily was worse. She refused to leave her bed, curling into a ball and muttering about the voices. They're angry, she said, her nails digging into her palms. They want me to listen. I checked her chart. Her vitals were stable, but her fear was real. Too real. That evening, I stayed late to finish paperwork. The ward was quiet, save for the occasional cough or shuffle from a patient's room. Then the whispering started again, louder this time, spilling from every wall on the floor. It wasn't just my name now, it was a chorus of voices, overlapping, pleading, accusing. Help us! You left us! Sarah, why? I grabbed a flashlight and followed the sound, my breath fogging in the chilly air. It led me to the old wing, a section of St. Agnes sealed off decades ago after a fire. The door was padlocked, but the whispers poured through the cracks, insistent and desperate. I called maintenance to open it, claiming a patient might have gotten inside. When they cut the lock, the voices stopped, like a radio switching off. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with ash and rot. Charred beams sagged overhead, and the floor was littered with debris, old gurneys, shattered glass, a scorched nurse's cap. My light caught something else, scratches on the walls, hundreds of them etched into the blackened plaster. Names, dates, please. Trapped 1943, don't forget us, Sarah, help. My name, carved over and over, though I'd never been here. I stumbled out, slamming the door behind me. The next morning, I dug into the hospital's history. In 1943, a fire had swept through the old wing during a lockdown. Dozens of patients died, trapped behind barred windows and locked doors. The official report blamed faulty wiring, but rumors said the staff abandoned them, too scared to go back in. Emily vanished that day. Her room was empty, her restraints undone, no sign of forced exit. The cameras showed her walking toward the old wing, then static. We searched, but she was gone. The whispers stopped after that, but sometimes when I pass her room, I feel them, eyes in the walls, watching, waiting, whispering my name in a language I can't unhear. I've never been superstitious. 5 years at Crestview Behavioral Health taught me to focus on what's tangible: meds, schedules, patient behavior. But last winter, something happened that I can't explain, something that started with a chart and ended with a shadow I can still feel on my back. It began with Daniel Reese, a 35-year-old vet with PTSD and insomnia. He was a big guy, broad-shouldered, but his hands shook like a kid's. He'd been admitted after a breakdown, claiming he saw shapes following him, dark, human-like figures just beyond the light. We started him on sedatives and he seemed to settle. But on his third night, I noticed something odd about his chart. I was updating his file at the nurse's station when I saw it. A shadow on the page, cast by nothing. The desk lamp was steady, no one else was around, but there it was, a silhouette of a head and shoulders, stretching across the paper. I flipped the chart over, checked the light, even moved to another seat. The shadow stayed, faint but solid, like ink bleeding through. I brushed it off as a trick of tired eyes and went to check on Daniel. His room was dark, the blinds drawn, but he was awake, sitting on the bed with his knees to his chest. "They're closer," he whispered, staring at the corner. I followed his gaze, nothing but bare wall. "Who's closer, Daniel?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "The shapes," he said. "They're not outside anymore. They're in here." I scanned the room, the hairs on my neck prickling. The air felt off, too still, with a faint hum like distant machinery. I adjusted his dose and left, but that shadow stuck with me. The next night, it was back, darker now, spreading across his entire chart. I showed it to a colleague, Lisa. She saw it too, her face paling. "That's not normal, Mike," she muttered. Daniel's condition worsened. He stopped sleeping, pacing his room, muttering about the shapes touching him. One night, I caught him scratching at his arms, leaving red welts. "They're cold," he said, his voice hoarse. "They grab me when I close my eyes." I requested a psych eval, but before it happened, things escalated. During a midnight round, I found his room empty. The bed was unmade, the window locked tight. I alerted security, and we searched the ward. We found him in the basement, curled up near the furnace, shivering despite the heat. "They followed me," he gasped, his eyes wild. "They're everywhere." I helped him back upstairs, but as we passed a hallway mirror, I saw it. A shadow behind him, tall and featureless, its edges rippling like smoke. It wasn't his shadow, the angle was wrong, and it moved when he didn't. I blinked and it vanished. After that, the shadows spread. They appeared on other patients' charts, on walls, flickering in my peripheral vision. The ward felt darker, colder, the silence oppressive. Daniel screamed one night, and when I ran in, he was clawing at the air, blood dripping from his fingers. "They're inside me," he yelled. We restrained him, sedated him, but his pulse spiked, then stopped. "Cardiac arrest," the coroner said. "No clear cause." The shadows faded after he died, but I still see them sometimes. Faint outlines on charts, hovering in corners. I asked about Daniel's past. Turns out he'd been stationed near an abandoned base overseas, a place locals called Cursed. He'd brought something back, something that latched onto him, and maybe onto me. I check my reflection every shift now, waiting for that shadow to step closer.